inaugural virtual forum hosted by SIEPR, the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, and the Stanford Environmental and Energy Policy Analysis Center, SEEPAC, a joint venture of SIEPR and the Precourt Institute for Energy here at Stanford. I'm Mark Duggan, the Trione Director of SIEPR and the Wayne and Jody Cooperman Professor of Economics here at Stanford. I'm joined today by SEEPAC Director Larry Goulder, who I'll turn things over to in a moment. First, I want to give a little background on SEEPAC, which was established in 2010 to develop practical and economically viable solutions to the pressing energy and environmental problems facing 21st century societies. SEEPAC undertakes and disseminates research that can help decision makers shape environmental and energy policy. Beyond discovering innovative solutions to problems, SEEPAC aims to influence policy decisions through close interactions with state, federal, and global decision makers. Larry is certainly the perfect expert to be leading today's discussion about environmental justice and policy challenges against the backdrop of California's air pollution. The size and scope of California are so enormous that what happens in this state truly has repercussions around the world. And I'm very proud that we're able to bring together some top experts to talk about this today. In addition to leading SEEPAC and being a senior fellow at SIEPR, Larry is the Shuzo Nishihara Professor in Environmental and Resource Economics at Stanford. He teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in environmental economics and policy, and his research considers the costs and benefits of various policies, as well as the distribution of policy impacts across industries, income groups, and generations. So with that introduction, let me turn things over to Larry, who will introduce today's panelists.
I was muted, but now I'm not. Thank you, Mark, again. I'm very much looking forward to this roundtable discussion. We're going to focus on environmental issues associated with air pollution in California. The state of California is widely considered a leader in improving environmental quality. Among the state's accomplishments are that it's led the way in promoting reductions in pollution from automobiles. It's also been a leader in helping bring about the transition from fossil fuel generated electricity to renewables generated electricity. But at the same time, there are very serious air pollution problems in the state and very great differences in air quality across municipalities and across counties, all with associated health impacts and ethical issues. My colleague, Charlie Kolstad, and I were very much involved in the planning of this event. And we're really delighted that some of the most important leaders and decision makers on the issue of air pollution and environmental justice accepted our invitations to participate. So let me introduce them. Chanell Fletcher is Deputy Executive Director for Environmental Justice at the California Air Resources Board. In that role, she has a key position in the design and the implementation of environmental justice related efforts by the board, which is considered the most important California government agency dealing with air pollution. Dina Argüello is Executive Director of Physicians for Social Responsibility in Los Angeles. It's a position she's held since 2007. And in her role as Executive Director, as well as through other affiliations, including her membership on the California EPA Environmental Justice Committee, she's been very influential in promoting channels through which local governments can influence state-level decisions on air quality policy. And this is a very important aspect that's being cultivated these days. Christina Garcia is a member of the California State Assembly, where she's represented District 58 since 2012. Her district encompasses parts of Los Angeles County. Christine has been a leading advocate and decision maker on several important policy issues, including environmental justice issues associated with air pollution. She was, in fact, the sponsor of the 2017 bill AB 617, which is perhaps the most important piece of environmental justice and air quality legislation to have emerged from Sacramento in recent decades. And that legislation will certainly be a focal point in much of our roundtable discussion. So welcome to you all. Look forward to your insights, Look forward to your interactions. So let me mention our planned format. I'm going to turn the floor over, or the Zoom microphones over, to each panelist, where each will have about 5 minutes for initial comments, perhaps to indicate what they characterize as current air pollution problems or where they most want to focus their efforts. That's just by way of introduction. Then we'll devote about 40 minutes to a roundtable discussion where I'll pose questions to the panelists, and they should feel free to converse with each other as they respond. And during this time, we'll be collecting questions from the viewers, and in the last 15 minutes, we'll invite the panelists to respond to these submitted questions. But first, if you'll allow me, I want to offer just a few bits of background, which I think will be helpful. First, there really are significant disparities, both in the levels of air pollution across parts of the states, as well as in exposures to air pollution across various demographic groups. As you may know, economically disadvantaged citizens and minorities are disproportionately represented in communities near serious pollution sources, such as refineries, electric power plants, cement plants. They also tend to live closer to truck routes, a source of significant diesel-related air pollution. The California Air Resources Board, in particular, indicated recently that moving to clean-burning trucks could prevent over 5,000 premature deaths each year. The second main point I want to make, just by way of introduction or as background, we're all talking about climate change these days. Well, there's very important and controversial connections between climate change policy and local air pollution policy. And as you know, a big component of California's climate policy is its cap and trade system, which allows for trades and permits to emit carbon dioxide. And this system raised very serious concerns about environmental justice. Concerns that, in particular, the trading of permits for carbon dioxide, the greenhouse gas, would in fact also lead to increased emissions of local air pollutants correlated with carbon dioxide, like sulfur dioxide or nitrogen oxides. Especially worrisome was that in some low-income and minority neighborhoods, these might be neighborhoods where the covered facilities that were regulated might purchase emissions rights and thereby not reduce their emissions instead of reducing emissions. This came to a head about 4 years ago when cap and trade was up for renewal. Several critics called for the elimination of cap and trade rather than renewing it for another decade. It wasn't at all clear at the time whether cap and trade would survive at all as part of California's climate policy. Well, as it turned out, the legislature ultimately took a two-pronged approach. They decided not to scrap cap and trade, but rather to renew it for the decade from 2020 to 2030, while at the same time complementing it with another piece of legislation, which I already mentioned, AB 617, which directs the state to introduce additional measures directly aimed at local pollutants and local air quality, something that cap and trade was not designed to do. And as mentioned, Christina Garcia sponsored this important legislation, and other members of this panel certainly influenced its ultimate form. So I'm going to put on my professor's hat and very briefly refer to a diagram just to make things concrete, but it'll only be 1 minute, I promise you. But I need to be able to find the share screen thing. Okay, I hope that this works. Okay, you're seeing more than I was aiming to have you see. I hope that you can see a diagram now, which basically shows what's happening under AB 617 under California's Community Air Protection Law. 3 things I want to say about it. One is that communities or neighborhoods can apply to be designated communities that are suffering issues of environmental justice because they are disproportionately exposed to pollution. And if they are chosen, I think there's something like 15 or so that have been chosen. These are indicated by the dots here. Then they are eligible to apply for state funding to help them deal with pollution And that's a very important piece. This would come from the state funding. Secondly, and importantly, there's a community-centered element to this, that is community-sourced elements. The communities can have significant influence in exactly what is being done in order to deal with pollution. This is called community-driven regulation, and it's an important principle of what's going on. I just got a note saying to unmute myself. I hope I'm not muted, am I? I'm not, okay. All right. And then the third thing I want to mention is that the measures that are being used in order to improve air quality and deal with environmental justice are suggested here. This is obviously a simplification, but those measures include community-supported pollution reduction programs, better monitoring, better reporting, better enforcement, introduction of penalties for violations of the legislation, grants to local community groups for investments to improve the local environment. So I want to suggest that that's where we are now. And I'm sure the participants on this roundtable will have more to say about AB 617, about perhaps its limitations as well as strengths and ways going forward. So with that as background, I look forward to some really good exchanges about the current state of affairs, about promising ways forward, and about the political challenges and obstacles, and also about the cost issues that perhaps need to be overcome. So with that, I will turn the controls over to our speakers, and I'll arbitrarily ask, let's start with Martha, if she will. Martha, can you offer your 5-minute intro? Thank you.
I'm muted. Good evening, everybody. Boy, I'm a bit of a storyteller, so I'm going to tell you a couple of stories. So for many years, Physicians for Social Responsibility Los Angeles was trying to work on air quality, and we were trying to engage in the South Coast, and we've been working on a number of issues at the South Coast, everything from freeway expansion around the 710, working with the communities in South LA and Southeast LA. We were very, very active in the campaign to eliminate perchloroethylene from dry cleaning, and that's another wild story of if we would have done it right then, we would be in a better situation now for many of the mom and pop owners of dry cleaners, but that's another story. But Los Angeles has some of the worst air quality in the country. We compete between the Central Valley, Los Angeles, and Houston in terms of bad air quality by the clean air standards. And we have been unable to meet the clean air standards for many, many years. We have epidemic numbers of children in our communities with asthma. In some communities, you know, a fourth of the kids are carrying inhalers, and that's from the Central Valley through Southern California. And I'm going to focus on South LA, but let's not forget that the Central Valley, in fact, yes, you know, in the last few days, a number of groups in the Central Valley have sued the EPA because it's not meeting those standards and doesn't think it will. And neither does the South Coast. So we could not get anybody in the world that funds our work to pay attention to air quality, even though it's a major driver of disease and disparity, because literally the carbon had sucked the air out of the room. People only wanted to talk about carbon. And we're sitting there, but carbon is the co-pollutant, right? And we saw the development of policies that actually were ignoring the air pollution problem while focused on just reducing carbon. And, you know, we couldn't understand that, you know, we literally had to explain the cap and trade program using poker chips, right? About how it works. And I'm like, but that doesn't make the air pollution less, right? And I kept thinking, maybe I'm just not understanding what's going on. But no, clearly I was understanding that a cap and trade program designed to reduce greenhouse gases, ignoring air pollution, was not going to work out for our communities in terms of health disparities. And we kept trying to convince people that air pollution was a problem, and we couldn't do it, right? And I remember a a few days before Barry Wallerstein, who was the head of the South Coast Air Quality Management District, was fired, I ran into him at the County Board of Supervisors. And we just had a conversation. He goes, we need more people at the mic. I'm like, you know that nobody will support us, to be at the mic at those board meetings takes a lot of resources, a lot of organizing, a lot of education, a lot of work to get someone from the community all the way out to the South Coast Air Quality Management District in Diamond Bar. And nobody was investing in that. And we kept trying to figure out a way to do it. And we were doing it in small scale because we weren't a large organization. At that point, we were 3 staff and working with a lot of other alliances to try to make people realize that you can't separate air pollution from climate policy, and that your good climate policy is actually really good air pollution policy that tells polluters, thou shalt not pollute. Thou shalt reduce your air emissions, right? Because that's where we breathe. Right? Not only do you have political benefit because people will breathe better and be healthier, but you've got that public health benefit. And it gives you time to scale the solutions that you need because the problem is much bigger than just the air pollution, right? I understand, greenhouse gases. I understand that climate is a massive emergency in the communities that we work with, but you have to do both. And the innovations have to be around reducing that air pollution. So we were trying to do this work, and then 617 happened, right? And I remember, there was, and I missed that meeting when Christina came to LA. I think I was in Sacramento that day when she was in LA, and met with the governor, and communities were asking, these are the regulations that we need. We need regulations that address those loopholes that allow, massive expansion of warehouses that are indirect sources of pollution that aren't being considered. We need to be able to engage with the districts in a different way. And so we got, and I'm really reducing this story, there's lots that happened in between. And then we get 617. We weren't sure, right? Because for many of us, it's like, what, air monitoring? We don't need air monitoring. We actually need to tell the agencies to regulate air. Thou shalt not pollute. Thou shalt reduce their emissions, right? That is what we've been asking for a long time. So 617 actually allowed us to have a conversation with funders, with the regulatory agencies. And my view of it when it first passed was I was incredibly skeptical. I am still skeptical, but there's moments when I see, okay, here's where we can make some change of the culture of the agency. Here's some ways that we can actually educate legislators to not forget about air pollution. And the other part is all the resources that came into to the communities, and which still aren't sufficient, because the 617 to actually implement it takes time, treasure, and talent. And it takes, there's a 1-year timeline. That's a regulatory timeline, right? Regulators do what they do. But that's not the timeline for how communities actually learn about a problem, engage in a problem, and do radical solutioneering. It's not on a 1-year timeline. So that timeline actually is in the way of the kind of engagement that we want. And we recognize that we actually need new forms of governance and new ways to interact with government to address the scale of the problem of climate change and air pollution and fires and everything else, right? So we're really clear that all of those things are happening at once, and it's not always easy, and it's often messy. I think I've done my 5 minutes. So all of this is to say, we're happy that now, there's recognition of the role of air pollution and climate change. We just have to get better at it, right? The scoping plan and the implementation of AB 32, I think sometimes they are sort of in this very siloed perspective. Let's just focus on greenhouse gases. The scoping plan should have a major section that says, thou shalt reduce your emissions so people can breathe better. So I'll stop there.
Oh, thank you very much, Martha. You've raised a number of intriguing issues, important ones, including the question of, is this attention to monitoring a distraction from what should be more attention to actually reducing emissions? I think we will get back to that. But if we go in alphabetical order, then the next on our list would be Chanell Fletcher. So, and by the way, I hope it's okay with all of you if I call you by your first names. this will save us about 5 or 10 minutes in terms of the time we take for this roundtable. So Chanell, are you willing to go second?
I am very willing to go second. I would also say that if Assemblywoman Christina Garcia wants to go ahead of me and talk about AB 617, happy to defer to her too, but she's shaking her head, so I can go.
Okay.
So I really, I'm really honored to be on this panel with, I think, honestly, such amazing women and people that I just admire and have just a huge amount of respect for. So thank you both so much for all that you guys continue to do for the state of California. I'm happy to be here. So I think, as you already shared, Larry, my name is Chanell Fletcher. I'm the Deputy Executive Officer of Environmental Justice at the California Air Resources Board. We do have kind of like, you know, within our agency, we are focused on air pollution. And that comes from, you know, way back historically, I think when we're looking at the city of Los Angeles, right? And it was covered in smog. And there was really this question of, who is going to deal with this smog and the impacts of the air pollution? What is the agency that's going to be focused around that? And that's really where I think the California Air Resources Board, the genesis happened. It was like, how do we tackle smog and air pollution? In addition to that, with, you know, the passage of AB 32, and really thinking about climate and really setting targets for ourselves, right? The target in 2020, the target in 2030 around reducing our emissions. That's when climate really became the focal point also for the California Air Resources Board. And so we're really looking at how are we kind of like reducing greenhouse gas emissions and how are we addressing air pollution and looking at air toxics. And so it is a very big mission. I think, as you know, I think as Martha was sharing, right, like this is something that has to be worked at together and holistically, right? We can't look at these in silos. We can't have one thing here talking about just, you know, GHG emissions and one thing over here talking about air pollution. We really do have to look at this. How are we reducing them together and seeing those impacts on communities? Because it's not that communities are just like, we're just, you know, dealing with the impacts of climate, it's the impacts of air pollution, it's the wildfires, right? It's not, it's compounding issues. And so I think being in this position, which is new for CARB, has really been, how are we at CARB addressing environmental justice? What does that look like and mean for us to actually operationalize that? And how are we advancing racial equity? And again, I think, what does that mean and look like for a state agency to really be thinking about racial equity, understanding that government was the one that perpetuating those inequities. And that's really, I think, the history that we're also grappling with as well. Today, I wanted to just say a few points. I think one about, you know, when we're talking about air pollution, as I mentioned, for CARB, I think this really is looking at AB 617 and our implementation of AB 617, what we've been charged with. And so far, it's been 3 years. So depending on how you're looking at that spectrum, that's either a lot of time or it's a little time. But in that 3 years, and Larry, you are into that amazing graphic, which kind of showed 15 communities that have been selected. And it also showed that I think, you know, there is that focus on communities, which is loud and clear in AB 617. But there's also other pieces of it, which I think I wanted to just flag very quickly, that it also talks about appropriating funding to support early actions to address localized air pollution through targeted incentive funding. There's also a piece in there that's talking about the new requirements for accelerated retrofit of pollution controls on industrial sources, increased penalty fees, and overall just greater transparency around the data that's happening around air quality and air pollution. And so I bring up those points because one of the things that's been powerful about AB 617 is the creation of our community steering committees. We also call them CSCs, really thinking about, again, and we're still working on, like, how do we operationalize community-driven community-driven reductions, you know, participatory budgeting. Those are things that are coming up in those community steering committees. But in addition to that, we're also thinking about how are we using the funding that we have to really kind of support addressing those localized air pollution challenges, and how are we also, I think, really thinking about retrofitting pollution controls to, again, I think, really reduce air pollution. So I think this program is, I think, very big and broad in its scope. And so it's one of the things I think we really are, I think, working hard with communities and air districts to achieve the promise of AB 617. With all of that said, I think there are some key things that we really do when we're looking at AB 617 want to see change that we really want to think about. I think for the next 2 years, we're really thinking about how are we redesigning this program, really, again, to think about community-driven and operationalizing environmental justice, and what does that look like and mean, and how do we do that in partnership, right, with communities. One thing I really want to highlight, and I can share more about it, is this People's Blueprint. And for those that don't know, we at CARB developed the blueprint, right? And that's basically like the strategy of AB 617. And then I think we funded an effort which was really led by community members to develop a people's blueprint. And in this people's blueprint, it really is the people and really in communities saying, here are the things that we really want to see in the next iteration of the blueprint, which is really mapping out the strategy for AB 617. We want to see things like I mentioned, participatory budgeting, right? That's the opportunity for the community to really be engaged in the process of like, how are we budgeting and allocating funds in AB 617? We want to see real conflict resolution, right? Because I think, as I mentioned before, if we're talking about that role of government perpetuating inequities, there really has to be an honest conversation, right? Of like, when we're talking about something being community driven and making those shifts, if we are having conflicts, how are we resolving those and how are we kind of really thinking about the mediation around that? And there's a really strong focus on equity and really seeing that be operationalized within the program of AB 617. So that's one thing that we at CARB are thinking about, right? Is like, how do we start to build and sustain those effective partnerships? How do we use that people's blueprint as a way to really, I think, start asking us to grapple with some of those challenges that are in the blueprint and starting to think about some of the challenges that are even in AB 617 implementation that we're currently facing. I think other things that we wanted to emphasize is really learning from the AB 617 communities that have been selected. So what does it look like for us to take the lessons that communities have learned, right? So these are not lessons that CARB has learned, but communities have learned and CARB has been able to also partner with and see those lessons. And how do we take that and start to uplift those learnings for other communities across the state? And that's really thinking about the fact that, you know, while we do have 15 communities, we have 11 SIEPs that are approved, we have about 300 plus like eligible communities that are eligible to be a 617 community. And so how does it, or how do we take those lessons and expand on those and really think about what that could look like and mean for those eligible communities? Another point that I would want to just flag is that we do have these AB 617 community air grants. And we see this as a valuable resource for communities really to start providing their own technical assistance and start to think about how do they themselves have the resources to do some of this air monitoring, to start to gather some of this data and some of this information to start to really address the challenges that they're seeing faced, right? And so we just kind of closed, I think, on October 1st, our round for, I think it's our third round for the community air grants. We'll be doing that selection process, and those will be announced in the spring of next year. But this is really a huge opportunity for communities to start to take things in their own hands with those funds and really think about, here is what we want to address as a community. Here are the funds that, you know, we have to do that with, and how do we create this, and again, kind of operationalize that community-driven approach to addressing these challenges around air pollution. I think the last point I'll raise is enforcement. And I think one of the things that we really do want to do is be more responsive and a more productive partner with local communities and air districts when we're talking about enforcement. And one of the things that I think we've learned is that communities really are the experts, right? Communities are the ones that are on the ground. They're the ones that are seeing the challenges. They're the ones that are kind of experiencing those challenges. And so how do we, when we're talking about, when we're working through that lens of enforcement, really prioritize that community level focus, that community driven approach to make sure that we're prioritizing the right things in our enforcement. And so that's something that I think we're really focused on and thinking about, like how we can develop those community specific work plans informed by community engagement and making sure that that community engagement isn't just to check the box, but it's actually shaping our enforcement priorities and there's actual tangible outcomes that the communities can see. In addition to kind of the AB 617 points that I wanted to raise, I'll also kind of flag, since I think we did talk a little bit about the scoping plan. And I think one of the things that I will say is that, one, I'm very honored that Dina is one of our co-chairs for the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, because I think some of the questions that we're grappling with in AB 617 are similar questions that we're grappling with when we're talking about the scoping plan, right? We're talking about the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, and it really is thinking about how do we start to shift that model to thinking about what does it look like and mean for the scoping plan to kind of be addressing the needs of communities, the needs of all Californians as we're reducing GHG emissions, and how do we make sure that these aren't these siloed efforts, right? But that we're really working together holistically to address the challenges that we're seeing around climate and air pollution. So I think that's my 5 minutes as well. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. A lot of issues that I'm eager for us to follow up on. Just for clarification, just should be clear that the scoping plan is the plan by the Air Resources Board about where to go forward on climate change policy. And as you mentioned, I think very correctly, there are important environmental justice issues there and important interactions between local air pollution policy and climate policy, maybe something we can turn to. Just one reaction before we go to Christina, which is, it seems like everyone's got to be in favor of environmental justice. And the real issue is cost for many. I'm interested in exploring what you all see as the sources of opposition to some of these measures, particularly those that might say, this is too costly, we can't afford spending more on monitoring equipment, or we can't afford offering this much more in terms of investments by communities. I think there really are political issues. In many ways, perhaps this problem is to a large extent a political problem, and I'd be very interested in seeing what you all think about that. So with that, let's turn to Christina, who can tell us about whatever she wants, including AB 617, but not necessarily exclusively so.
Thank you. I'm not going to talk about AB 617 too much, but I'm sure we'll keep talking about it. I grew up in the city of Bell Gardens. It's a working class Latino immigrant community. You grow up thinking that success is like leaving and never coming back. And I think it paints this false narrative that there's no talent here, or people don't care, or there's no leadership. And there's a lot of leadership out here. And so I think, how do we develop that leadership, and how do we ensure that we instill a sense of coming back and sharing that leadership with the community and lifting us all up along the way? And at times, there's kind of really little incentive to move back, because it's a working class community, and I have a lot of pride for being from this area. But it's also a community that suffers from some of the worst air quality in the nation, which means that we have serious health issues. And it's not just that. If you were following the pandemic, we were also the epicenter of, high infection rates, of high hospitalization rates, of high death rates. When it was time to get vaccines, initially there was a lot of discussion about equity, but vaccines were not showing up here. And so I was constantly pulling up maps and calling them my receipts and sending them to the governor and putting them on Twitter saying, hey, we're saying equity, but I don't see how these areas that are the most impacted aren't getting the least vaccines to begin with. And so a lot of my time in the legislature has been about putting faces and stories behind what it's like to be in these communities out there. The maps and the data tell a story, and I do think they are powerful. It makes it a lot harder for individuals to ignore us, and gives us a direction of where we need to be going. But we need to make sure we have the political will to get there. And it's not about cost. It's, do we have the political will to change the culture of how we treat these communities? We treat these communities like we're disposable. We treat us like we're a wasteland. When Governor Brown came to tour this area, we were wrapping up the tour before he met with community groups. And he told me, wow, this is really a wasteland, and I don't even see where we start out there. And I said, if that's going to be the attitude, then I don't want to take you to meet with my community groups, because we have a lot of pride in our community. And for us, you need to start, because it's our lives that are in danger. It's our children who are being affected in their ability to learn. And it should be more, instead of why haven't we started sooner, where there's such a sense of urgency out there. And so it was a big fight. Jerry Brown had gotten everything he wanted. And for myself, I've been on the outside, I've been the activist, and I'm really good at throwing stones. But now I'm in the legislature, and it's been about, how do I put a spotlight on an issue that people don't want to focus on? Like Martha said, no one was paying attention, and you felt like a crazy lady talking about clean air and health and so forth. And so it was like, how do I put a bigger spotlight? And the discussion around cap and trade allowed for that. We initially had a bill that was much stronger around cap and trade, and it was only a 41 vote bill, and I couldn't get that off the assembly floor. And so again, I go back to that political will. When that bill died, we got pushed out of the discussion, and we had to claw our way back in. But I'd been there long enough to see Jerry Brown collect the votes he needed always, and he was working with the Republicans, and I kind of saw the writing on the wall, and I said, something's going to get done. How do I get something for clean air? How do we keep a spotlight on that issue? How do we do the first step? And let me be clear, people talk about AB 617. It was always a down payment. And in my head, it was just opening the door so that we could build on that. And there hasn't been, in my opinion, enough follow-up legislation. But I do see things changing, and I do see things improving. One, community members are part of these action groups. And I think for a lot of us, you get desensitized and you kind of think this is normal, and it's just, it is, and we just have to accept. And I think these community action plans and groups coming together and the leadership that we're sharing has reminded us that this is not normal and we shouldn't settle for this, and it change is long overdue. I think too, it's starting to change the culture in these organizations that have always had no problem saying, we will continue to dump in this out of town because it's already a wasteland, so who cares? And not think about the individuals and the families there. And so I think it's beginning to change that culture. CARB or the local air districts are talking about environmental justice, but it's not going to happen overnight, and it's going to be painful because it's not something that's natural to them. It's not what they were established to do, and changing that power dynamic is gonna take time. But we're starting to see it little by little. We got an indirect source role, which is one of the top items the community groups asked for Jerry Brown to do when he came to visit us, and he said that's impossible. And so it wasn't done there, but it's been done now here in the South Coast. Recently, both the Bay Area and the South Coast passed additional rules to start those retrofits for the refineries. And they should have been sooner, but the reality is that until those refineries are closed, we're not going to get to what our community needs, which are, no emissions from these places. And so we will reduce emissions through some of these retrofits. But the reality is, for us, have been here generation after generation, and we see our family members having a shorter lifespan or cancer being a normal thing. It's not just enough to reduce, but how do we eliminate these reductions? And so AB 617 is never going to be the solution to it all, but I do think it's moving forward. But I do think we're at a point where we say, how do we do AB 617 2.0? Or what are the additional pieces of legislation we need, including a health metric? I did have a health metric part of the scoping plan legislation last year that didn't get out of the Senate, but we do need to put it in terms of that, because the emission reductions have to go to creating healthier communities. At the end of the day, that's what we care about. That's what we need to be committed to out there. And so AB 617 is just one of the many things I do around environmental justice. Been working on water, soil, and air, because this community, like all the other communities that are part of that inventory of overburden communities, are suffering not just with air quality, but with soil contamination, with water quality issues. Look, they're all working class communities, usually communities of color. They're both in urban and rural settings out there, but communities that we have always felt like are dispensable out there. And so, and the last thing is, how do we scale up? There's no justice if I know there's 300 communities that deserve to be AB 617 communities, but we're not doing the community work there with the different agencies, then we're leaving a lot of communities behind. And so how do we scale up? How do we pass new rules so that it's not just about the Southeast, but all the other communities in the region that need us to look into that. And so for me, the issue is never about cost. The issue is about political will. The cost is pretty costly already. It's cutting my life shorter. It's giving us a lot of diseases, from asthma to cancer to heart diseases. It's killing us sooner. And our kids, we know that their ability to grow and think and be the leaders we need is affected by all the pollution around them. And so the costs are already too much and have been going on for too long out there. And I hope that through this work and this additional spotlights on the issues, my colleagues get that political will to finally say, like Martha says, you must reduce. And I think that's probably my 5 minutes.
Well, thanks, Christina, and thank you all for getting us off to a great start. Let me respond in a way, follow up by asking two questions. First, an observation. The observation is, I think there's a lot of agreement among you all, if I heard you all correctly, in terms of wanting to amp up, as it were, AB 617. That is, make sure that the provisions that are already in that legislation are fully exploited, like introducing low-cost sensor technologies, better monitoring, tighter regulation, penalties for violations of the regulations, more community sourced influence on the process. What isn't as clear to me yet is what specific elements you would want in new legislation that goes beyond AB 617? What would be the particular provisions? Now, there's been some hint of that when you referred to what might need to be done in terms of retrofitting refineries. But I'd like to hear more about, if you had your druthers, what would you like to do next? What would be the succession to AB 617, whether it's called version 2 or a whole new number? And then also, my second question is, so feel free to weave in between either of them, where do you see the political opposition to what you want? Where are the political challenges that need to be overcome? What's going to be the biggest challenge getting through the reforms that you are interested in? So in a nutshell, it's what do you see as the reforms you'd like to see? And second, what are the political obstacles that you think are going to be the most challenging to overcome? And I'll let you all respond to this any way you want, in any order. So whoever wants to go first may do so. Oops, Martha, you are muted.
I'm overly caffeinated, which is going to be a dangerous thing later.
Okay.
I think one, eliminating the element of competition among communities, right? Because it feels like pick me, and then we play the oppression Olympics, or who's most polluted Olympics, which is just not a good approach. So we've been talking about a sector-based approach that takes the solutions that some communities have found that are effective and apply them to the sector. So in South LA, we looked for, there's all the transportation sources, and we know we've got to move beyond the internal combustion engine and do it quickly and replace everything. But there's also the industrial sources and the cumulative impacts. So we've been looking at what are the most overrepresented industries in those, and figuring out what is an equitable transition. How do we, sort of a harm reduction. So with auto bodies, harm reduction. How do we go in and do, control technologies, but also material substitution? We're doing the same with the metals industry and working with actually leaders in the metal industry who said, I don't want lead in my effluent, and developed a whole new way of producing an alloy that's used for water systems that's lead-free and doesn't leach, right? So we're finding those innovators and working with them and developing measures. And then with the dry cleaning industry that's going through huge changes, both in terms of who owns them, as mom and pop, mostly Korean owners, are selling often to their workers. So it's transitioning from primarily Korean-owned businesses to some Latino-owned businesses. Some switch from perchloroethylene and to green earth, which is not very good. It's a greenhouse gas emitter. So those are in many urban communities. Those three sectors are overrepresented. So how do we find those solutions that can be applied across the board? And then the funding, before I forget, because I know this is the hardest one, we need participatory budgeting. The communities do not trust the air districts, and for good reason, given their failure to meet clean air standards and to reduce pollution for many, many years. And so how those resources get allocated is going to be important. And that, more money needs to be spent preparing communities. We thought we were ready to be selected. We weren't. Even though we had those grants, still more was needed, because the prep we ran into the 1-year statutory deadline, and it just created conflicts. So I would fix, the budgeting, who controls the money, and make sure that there's a stronger oversight from community and the air districts, and then the sector-based approach. And then for some regulatory teeth to 617, so that we can tell them, thou shalt reduce your emissions. And if you can, you should prevent emissions. Sorry, that was a lot.
That was great, but you kind of clarified it for me as you went on. I was wondering where the funding would come from for the sector-based solutions that you've been focusing on. It comes through grants. So is the proposal, in effect, to ask the California Air Resources Board for more allocation of funds for such grants?
Yes, grants are good, but I actually want the bigger piece of the pie. I want to know how much money is going to the air districts, and I would like to have control over that, but I know I probably won't, but that's still what I want.
And also, just quick question.
And how they spend it.
How does this square with the idea of community-sourced changes. It sounds like this approach you might be thinking of would be more of a top-down approach, or am I misreading you?
No, it is a community sourced approach. So I didn't show you in the PowerPoint, but we identified those 3 sources because we actually mapped out all the pollution sources in the community. And those arose as the largest number of that represented a cumulative effect in South LA. And so the community, that's how those are, and we're working with communities to also find other solutions. So, yeah.
I'm wondering what our other panelists might think either about what Martha has said or what she hasn't yet brought out on this issue of where do you go from here beyond what's already implicit in AB 617, and where might be the biggest political challenges?
I'll give my wish list, as I've been working on bills that I can't even get a hearing on, so political hasn't been there. New York passed AB 617, brother, that's much better. But one of the reasons why it's much better is that there's a clear line in the sand of when they will be denying permits in overburdened communities. And that just recently, they've denied 2 new natural gas plants in overburdened communities that no one was expecting was ever going to happen. And so I would say that one of the things that I want to see is, if I know these are overburdened communities, whether they're one of the served communities or one of the 300 in our inventory that we know are overburdened, why are we allowing new permits of polluters to come in here? It feels pretty insulting. So I would say, first and foremost, there should be a clear line in the sand and new permits can't come in. If you are already there, then you shouldn't be able to change your permit to create a bigger footprint of pollution either, because that's the other thing that's happening in these communities where polluters are already there and they're saying, well, let me change my business model a little bit and let me do this other part and grow, and my pollutions also get larger. And so that should also, there should be a clear line in the sand. If you're in an overburdened community, we shouldn't have that. It just seems to me pretty logical. And then the last thing is, if you're there, retrofit, and you can't wait to retrofit till 2035. One of the most insulting things to me that happened with AB 617 is that by 2023, any facility in their cap and trade has to retrofit to best available technology. Then I had the local air district say, you know what? We interpret this to say that we just need to pass the plan by 2023, and these facilities don't have to retrofit until 2035, maybe later, because it's going to be too expensive for them. And so it was one of the most insulting things to me, because I was like, I was there, and that was not the intent. The intent is that by 2023, these facilities have retrofitted and they're better neighbors out there, because it's insulting to know we have technology that can make us healthier and we're not using it. And that should not be at the air district to pay for or the taxpayers to pay for, but they should be paying for that because they have plenty of profits out there that they could be using out there as well. And so I want to see that part also. If I got to say, that would also be part that we need to beef up out there. We have community action plans, and what happens if they're not implemented at the air district? I think communities should be able to sue the air districts when they're not following the plans that they develop with the community, as imperfect as they might be. And so those are a few items of what I would like to see as we move forward with AB 617, while still keeping a community focus and having these community groups that have developed start to mentor new community groups in all these other communities so that they can go after these grants, so that they don't have to wait to be selected out there, and can start to talk about specifically what's there. And I'll give you an example. For me, in my backyard, it's the trucks that choke me, because I have 6 freeways that define my district, and the rail yard, where all the goods that are moving from Long Beach and LA come through my district and into my district. And right now, everyone's talking about the port congestions and things aren't moving. Let me tell you that things are moving. That freeway next to my house is busy with trucks all the time. That train that normally runs once every other day is running every day, because I hear the horns nonstop in my window every night and every morning. And so as I see that work happening, I see much more pollution happening in my backyard. That's my focus. But when I talk to the folks at Shafter, they told me, you know what, pesticides are a real issue, and they're in my air, and we're not measuring that, and we're not doing anything about that. And so now that we're starting to see the measurements, they're starting to do some action there. The local air districts are refusing to work with the community on that issue, and so the state has had to intervene in there as well. And so I think that's in part because of the 617 work. But you need to still keep it community-based, because the issues are going to be different of what we need, and I don't want to lose that as we do the next iteration of what comes here next. And so that's my wish list. I've been working on this since 617 passed.
All right.
My coworkers.
Thank you.
And I have not been able to get the political will to get there because it's always this idea that it's too costly, that it's going to cost jobs. And so these false narratives that I just kind of refuse to accept. And so we should be able to have good jobs for these communities, and it should not be at the expense of my health or my neighbor's health.
Do you see the political balance tilting at all in anyone's favor?
I want to believe that there are opportunities for that political power to tilt, but I haven't seen it yet because I've introduced bills that every year have not even gotten the first hearing, much less gotten through the legislature out there, including last year. And so I want to believe that there's an opportunity and more people are talking about it. And I hope that we get there. Sense of urgency, because we've been waiting all our life. And so sense of urgency. And I tell my team that we're in the business of making the impossible possible. And sometimes it feels like the impossible. And so I want to believe that there's an opportunity that we just haven't figured out how to crack the nut. But I hope moments like this give us a little more strength and direction of where we need to get to.
So, Chanell, do you have any responses to what Martha and Christina have said? It's fine if you want to say you agree, or if there are points that you disagree with, I'd be interested as well.
No, I think in terms of legislation in general, I think as a state agency, it's not something that we typically comment on. So I think it was just really helpful to hear what the Assemblywoman shared and what Martha Dina shared.
Okay. Well, I think I'm going to be devil's advocate a bit, because I have a feeling that the panelists tend to be very much in agreement about what must be done. And I'm going to raise a couple controversial issues. I'm not inviting you to agree or disagree, but I'd be interested in your thoughts. I'm noticing a lot of attention with some unease to what's going on the climate front in California. And so one issue that's been controversial is the existing rules under California's current climate policy for offsets. Particularly, offsets are provisions whereby a covered facility that ordinarily would have to reduce emissions or comply with the program in California can effectively purchase the right to emit more by financing an activity or outside of the state even that is deemed to reduce emissions elsewhere. There's been a lot of controversy about that and unease about that, but those provisions remain. Economists, and I have to acknowledge that I'm one of them, say, well, there's a way of that's a way of reducing the costs of getting emissions reductions through offsets. We're looking at more low-hanging fruit. What is your view? And I'm assuming you're not too happy with them. If so, can you explain what is the nature of your opposition to offsets, if it is opposition? And excuse me if I'm presuming incorrectly. So the floor is open to anyone to respond to the issue of offsets.
I'll take that one. Yes, we're opposed to offsets because, again, it gets in the way of direct emissions reductions. The benefits are sometimes unverifiable. The benefits often, if there are benefits, burdens continue to be pushed on other communities, including the Global South. And so that doesn't work out for us. And again, we want to see more of a focus on direct emissions reductions. You can't separate the emissions at the source, the carbon from the other air toxics. So for us, as a matter of principle, we disagree with them. And we don't think our climate policy should be focused on reducing the cost of compliance to the people who got us in this mess. And offsets and these others have allowed us to delay direct emissions reductions. And here we are with a deepening climate crisis. And I don't think we have the luxury anymore of continuing bad behavior and somehow thinking it will be offset, in some future date. And it allows benefits to escape, right, from the communities we grew up in. My family lives in Huntington Park. I grew up near oil wells, right? So we still are not getting the benefits, but the burdens are still being placed on us.
Other comments about offsets?
I'll say that I get to be in the legislature and I have to go to count to 41 or 21 in either house. And if I need two-thirds, it's 54 and 27 out there. And so I've had to learn to compromise along the way and just getting the best deal. But if you just look at offsets as a concept out there, the idea that I'm going to allow you to continue to pollute in a community continues to perpetuate the idea that this community and the community members are disposable, that our health can be sacrificed for the greater good or for another group's benefit out there. And so, you know, I think as we try to compromise on offsets, and I was there for those discussions early on, it was like, how do we limit that? How do we try to have more offsets locally? When I think about even 617 in the community group, it's like, okay, well, if you're polluting here, not only do I want you to do the retrofits, but are there other ways you could mitigate and take care of other pollution I have in the community, because it's so expensive to clean it up out there as well. And so I think that discussion is there just in terms of being pragmatic and trying to get to the votes that I need to get something done out there. And so as we discuss offsets, I as a legislator, I take a little more agnostic approach, and it's like, how do I get the better deal? But if I go back to my activist ways and I put that hat on, I think it goes against the premise that we're saying that these communities matter and they're so overburdened that we should be putting them at the front of the line and their needs at the front of the line. Offsets goes against that.
And you know, the partnership between community and people like Assemblywoman Christina Garcia is incredibly important, because just like she tells her staff, your job is to make the impossible possible. That's what our job is, right? Yes, we understand the politics, but that does not mean we don't continue to push, because that's how you make it possible.
Well, I want to ask Chanell, who's this isn't to put you on the spot necessarily, but you're in a very special position, since you are right there smack in the middle of perhaps the most important agency in California to deal with air pollution issues and environmental justice issues. And I'm wondering, what do you see as, what's your strategy, if I may ask, for trying to budge the agency to do things it hasn't done before? And I guess I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, but in general terms, what do you see as, in a way, your most important way forward?
You know what? My apologies. I thought that there was more to the question, but that was the end of the question.
You can ask the question you want me to ask.
No, I think this is a really important conversation to have with you, with this panel, and the other 400 people that are watching right now, or that will be watching. I think I would say a couple of things. And I think I'm going to go back to Assemblywoman Christina Garcia's remarks around when she talked about kind of AB 617, right? And I think the passage of that, and having, you know, CARB and air districts do things that historically we haven't done. And then us being in this process of figuring out, like, what does that look like and what does that mean? And so I think when we're talking about, you know, about offsets, which you're right, it is a controversial question. And I think about us as an implementing agency, right? So what we're doing, it's directly, we're being asked to do, or we're being told to do it by the legislature, right? So there's a powerful relationship there in terms of, like, who is the one that's telling the agency to do it? And then I think there's a lot within what we're doing where we do need to be having those honest conversations with, you know, with environmental justice and with communities. And really, again, I think I go back to thinking about, well, when we talk about things being community driven, right? When we talk about meaningful engagement, and that not just being a check the box, but actually being something that we're doing that's going to shape and change outcomes and change what we're seeing. I think those are the kind of conversations we do need to be having, and they are challenging because it's not something that we're typically, as government agencies, used to doing. That's not how we're used to engaging. So we're flipping a lot of things on their head. With that said, I think that the hardest part about this is that change doesn't always come as quickly as we want. And sometimes we have to spend a lot of time, and probably Dina can express this, educating and re-educating people on this is why this is important. This is why we need to be having these conversations. This is why we need to be looking at things like, participatory budgeting. This is why we need to be looking at ways in which, it's not just the government making the decision in the silo, but we're really doing that together collectively with communities. And so I think that those are the ways in which, I'm one person in the agency, but really working with, I think, community members, working with the rest of our executive team, with our staff to really think about how do we shift that and how do we start to look at that, so we can have, I think, these kind of authentic conversations around challenging things like cap and trade and offsets.
Great. I wish you all the luck. I think you're in you have a very important role. Well, we're near the point, or probably even at the point, where we should open it up for questions from our viewers, but I cannot resist offering two observations. One is that I'm detecting that there remains, even with the AB 617 compromise, to go along, to have that in tandem with SB 398, the renewal of cap and trade. I detect quite a bit of concern, unease about the remaining cap and trade system. And my observation or point is that there are many who feel the cap and trade actually is reducing emissions, that is putting an overall cap on emissions. The problem being, it's putting a cap on emissions that may be coming from elsewhere through offsets, not just emissions within the state. And if we're only concerned about carbon dioxide, that would be fine, because the damage is done the same everywhere, irrespective of where the emissions come from. But when we're talking about local pollutants, then in fact, offsets can mean that it's basically a way that local emitters can find ways to keep emitting, and it makes local air quality worse. So I can see the source of concern there. But the other observation I would make is closely connected, which is that I'm interested in your thoughts. One might wonder whether part of the problem is the Clean Air Act, which it doesn't have strong enough rules about air quality at the community level. Because suppose it did, then one could basically have it both ways. One could say, all right, the Clean Air Act is going to ensure that there's good air quality locally, and we can still have offsets. So I just offer that as an idea. You may or may not agree. If anyone wants to respond to that and say it's too optimistic or what, but there does seem to be this connection. Any thoughts or reactions to that point? And in some of your own work, do you focus on trying to strengthen the Clean Air Act, the federal Clean Air Act?
So I do think we need to strengthen the federal Clean Air Act, and we have this new young man there who's in charge, and he's come out here a couple of times. I've been working on trying to bring him to the district to talk more about that and how they can be better partners, and how through their agency and the Clean Air Act are strengthening it. It could help give us better direction. At the end of the day, I get a lot of, well, we can't do that. That's not our jurisdiction out there. And so we all need to get on the same page, from top to bottom. And so I do think that's another piece of the puzzle. I don't think it's the only piece of the puzzle that matters, but I do think it's another piece of the puzzle out there. And I think, when Mary Nichols was nominated for that position, or was actually in the running, sorry, not nominated, in the running, I don't agree with a lot of Mary Nichols, but I do think it created an opportunity because we had been working on those relationships, the idea around like EJ and around how do we build on 617 and what's next, and what the advocates are saying are holding us accountable and not letting us lose sight of the field post of where we need to be going. That relationship was already there. I already had her come to my district. And so we're trying to figure those steps now with the person that did get appointed at the end of the day. But a real opportunity that we missed out on here in California when she didn't get that appointment. And there was so much opposition from some of the EJ groups out there. I think that's the irony, because I think having her there and the investment we had done to start to shift her mentality and the culture with her and their district, I think could have been helpful out there, because it takes time. And it takes even more time at the federal level than at the state level, as painful as it seems out there. And so, we work with what we can and keep moving forward. I think the criticisms that Martha has are all very fair, and just reminds me of the work that I have to continue to do. And then I hope that other members in the legislature join that work.
Okay, just for clarification, perhaps all of our audience members, viewers know, but Mary Nichols was the head of the Air Resources Board in California, and she was the front runner for the job when Biden came in to be the head of the US EPA. But she didn't get the job, and I think a significant reason for that was opposition by members of the environmental justice community, which makes it quite interesting that you, Christina, indicated that you think that might not have been the best move, but I can see that there were arguments on many sides on this one.
Yeah, I don't know. Just I now have to come up with a new plan. That's all. Maybe it is a better move, and I have to come up with a new plan.
I mean, you know, for us, we were part of the people that signed the letter, and so for us, it was because it was not serving us, and I think it's also a moment where lip service to environmental justice is no longer good enough, right? And luckily, we do have national relationships. We're a national movement, so we are connected to folks where Michael came from, and we have a new White House Environmental Justice Advisory Committee that is very well represented from people on the West who have been incredibly active. And we do what we always do. We organize, we take what we have and work with it to get more. So, but I think that for California in particular, it is time to have people in agencies that are committed to having the core of their mission be environmental justice, not sort of an aside or a thing you have to do because those people are too loud, right? So.
Well, there's a note of optimism coming from you, which is perhaps you think with Michael Regan as the head of the EPA, there will be more for federal level attention to environmental justice issues. Have you seen any evidence of this so far?
Look, everybody's good till they're not. That's what I've learned in this world. Everybody's great till they're not. Okay. And I never know when we're going to get to that not good anymore, right? So work with what you have. Go for it, Chanell.
But I was going to chime in on that point because I think part of what I appreciate about this conversation, and I think the candor of it is right. Like everybody's great until they're not, right? And I think there has to be a process or a way to kind of almost in some ways, I don't want to say schedule like an intervention because that's just a very strong term, but there's got to be a way to figure out, I think, when and if there's someone where like, if they're not great, can you call them in? Can you kind of say like, hey, this is why this didn't work and this is how we move forward? Because I do think that, it absolutely, I think as some woman, Christina Garcia said, like it takes time for these agencies to shift. It takes time for culture to shift and people to shift. And I think for us to have environmental justice to be central to, I think, our mission, one of the things that I'm learning is that we have to be able to not just be flexible and be responsive in the moment, but even when we mess up, we've got to be able to acknowledge that, to own that, and to figure out like, how do we have that conversation where we acknowledge, we own it, and then we figure out the path of how we move forward. And I think sometimes we can let our own defensiveness, or we can get stuck on the ways in which like we don't want to admit that we were wrong, whatever it is, whatever that thing is. And I think there's got to be a way to figure out like, hey, like, can I call you in? Can we have this conversation? And can we figure out the path forward? And I think that to me, especially I think in these government agencies where things take so much time, and we're talking about these we're talking about big issues of like strengthening the Federal Clean Air Act, looking at these kind of big programs, it's like we've almost got to be able to build that trust, I think, for government agencies, for communities, to be able to figure out like, how do we move these things forward? How do we do this together? And if there's a misstep, how do we mediate and resolve that issue so we can keep moving forward?
And can I say something though, to be fair to Michael at the US EPA, he's not a king out there. And so we need to give him a little bit of grace and a little bit of space to get his agency to move with him, to get the administration to move with him. I think he probably at his core, EJ is front and center, but he has to get everyone else around him to get there and follow and allow him to be a leader in that space. And it's not clear to me that that the administration is totally on board with EJ and that it's beyond just lip service at this point. I think Michael is, but I don't know that everyone around him is. And so that's going to take time. And on the flip side, my community doesn't have that time because it's generation after generation that we see how we're getting the short end of the stick. And it's like, how much longer do we have to wait? Like how many more relatives need to be sick or have cancer, or how many more cancer alleles do I need to identify before we take this bolder action out there? And so I don't have all the answers out there, but I think, we have to be prepared that the US EPA is not going to move as quickly as we need them to. And as an individual, the leader there might have a vision, but he doesn't get to do it on his own. And there's a lot of forces pushing in against him, including labor and our labor brothers and sisters. And we've seen how strong of a relationship Biden has to labor out there, and he has to balance that all the time out there. And so I'm a little more pragmatic and skeptical of how much we're going to be able to do there. And I focus on California is the 5th biggest economy. How do we lead by example in the meantime? So hopefully people will catch up to us. And so as behind us, it feels like we are when you're in the community and you're here feeling it. We, in some respects, have been making progress and are leading that discussion, but far from where we need to be and far from perfect.
Thank you for that observation. Very, very helpful. Well, let's take some questions. We've got some questions that have come from our viewers, and let me read one of them. The question is this. It starts with the statement: opportunity zones in California were designed to overlap with 617, AB 617, and other disadvantaged communities. What's been the effect of opportunity zone investments that you've observed? Who can take that?
I believe it would be me. Oh no, go for it.
No, I'm gonna be quick. I haven't
Okay.
seen too much of anything in my backyard yet. So while there's an overlap, we haven't seen enough yet. So I will say that about what I've seen.
So you haven't seen a whole lot of effect yet, is what you're all saying. Any other reactions?
But in fairness, it's only been a couple of years. And so, developing and implementing, but at this point, I haven't seen too much here in my backyard.
Are you comfortable with the opportunity zone concept?
Yeah, I think all these concepts are great. Just like 617, when we wrote it, was great to begin with, right? The implementation is what matters, and what the agencies are doing out there. And are people finding ways to take advantage of this to perpetuate a lot of the same stuff? There's a lot of distrust, and I share some of that distrust. I'm in a unique spot though, with a lot of privilege, and I get to pick up the phone and get on Zoom with someone at South Coast or someone at Cali PA or anywhere else. And if I'm really grumpy, I get to be really grumpy and push them, to do better. A lot of privilege in that. And so I still see these as tools that I get to use, and I do use. I have the stick when I need it, and then I put it down when I feel like, we're going to give you a moment to try to catch up.
Okay, thank you. Well, here's another question. The viewer asks, can the panelists comment on the Hernandez, Cortez, and Meng study? It's entitled, Do Environmental Markets Cause Environmental Injustice? Evidence from California's carbon market. And the argument or the finding from that paper, just to provide a little background, is that studied whether cap and trade has actually increased the disparities in local air quality. And that study, it's not the only one, but it's gotten a lot of attention, argues that cap and trade has not. It's argued that it's reduced emissions of local pollutants basically everywhere, but it's not the case that it's reduced the local pollutants more in rich communities than in poor communities. So therefore, the disparities have not been augmented by cap and trade. So we can turn this to a broader question if you don't want to refer to the Cortez, Hernandez, Cortez, and Meng paper in particular. But the question is, what do you think about the evidence? Do you think if there is good evidence that cap and trade has worsened the relative air quality between rich and poor neighborhoods? Are you agnostic, or do you think it might actually have reduced the differential? Any comments? You're muted, Martha.
No, I'm not. I'm thinking. I have the study on my reading list and I want to look at it. We asked the California Air Resources for an adaptive management plan that would actually track the trades in air pollution in real time so that if we needed to adjust. So when I saw that preliminary data, there were some increases in air pollution trends. Some they could attribute to cap and trade, others they couldn't. And that sort of killed the project. And so I still want to see, I know that there's some benefits coming, maybe not as quickly as we would like, but I think that that's kind of the problem, right? And it goes back to what Assemblywoman Christina Garcia said. In our communities, we are not seeing improvements to health or other improvements fast enough. And so if there is that perception in our communities, well, we're still not meeting clean air standards. So
thank you. Well, I think there's a strong case to be made that things have to go further. There's disagreements as to whether things are currently moving at all in the right direction, but I think this is something that we'll be getting more and more evidence about and more discussions about. We have time for one last question that's come in. We have talked about indoor pollution, and I'll read the question. How can policy solutions address indoor pollution, in parentheses, through air infiltration in the most affected communities, which are low-income communities? What are your thoughts about that?
I mean, yes, definitely. I think we need to think about the indoor pollution and things like switching out older appliances in these households, better insulation so we don't have as much coming in. But I think ultimately, when we're talking about the local issue, it's about the fact that I literally live next to a refinery, or I live next to a metal plating facility, and I just have gotten so accustomed and used to it, I forget that that's there. And so how do we reduce those emissions there? And so, I don't want to be dismissive of that, but I think at the end of the day, we need to focus on the source itself. That's my neighbor out there as well. I want to say that I've been looking, I love numbers. I've been looking at the data, and, I think about methane, I think about PM 2.5, because I live next to this freeway here in my community. And I see more trucks, I see more traffic. Even before this congestion, we're consuming more and more out there. When I look at the numbers, well, it hasn't gotten worse, but it hasn't gotten better. And so I think in some respects, it hasn't gotten worse because of the policies we have. Because if I think about it, I have even more trucks polluting me. I have even more trains polluting me. I have even more goods movements happening in my backyard. And it hasn't gotten worse, but if I have more of that, it technically should have gotten worse. So some progress has been made, but all I've done is still kept the status quo, which is the problem at the end of the day if it is about creating healthier communities. And so I think with our goods movements, with Amazon, with our immediate need to have products at our doorstep and, in 2 hours, I think communities like mine could be way worse off if we didn't have some of these policies, but still maintains the status quo. And so that's still a real problem. We still know that is still really shortchanging me. And so I think we have to think about how do we get more aggressive? Maybe the issue is not the policy, but it's not aggressive enough. Maybe I need to, have a clearer line in the sand. Maybe I need to, try to get there sooner. Maybe I need to have a little less offsets and more emission reductions and less money going someplace and more about just rules and regulations happening out there. And so I have been asking those questions. So like maybe we're moving in the right direction, but we're not moving boldly enough or quickly enough, and we need to accelerate those incremental changes.
And if I can just chime in on this question, because I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't. I think in terms of the indoor piece, I will say that that's been a huge priority for CARB, especially as I think we're talking about the wildfires, for example, right? So it's like if we're saying stay out, stay indoors, but indoors is just as bad as outdoors, right? Like I think that's something that we've been really focused on. And so I just wanted to say that I think, when we're talking about indoor pollution, we're talking about gas appliances, we're talking about personal care products, we're talking about like the gamut of things that can create emissions. And so we really are focused on a number of regulations, really focused on like how do we basically reduce those indoor pollutions. And I know that that we've had conversations and are in conversations with Martha, Dina, particularly talking about building decarbonization. And that's really looking at how are we decarbing within buildings, right? Looking at where the emissions are coming from, is looking at those gas appliances and what does it look like to electrify? How do we do that in a way where we're prioritizing and addressing the concerns from like low-income communities, where we're really thinking about residential buildings, right? So I think, and these are again, like these are these big issues that we're grappling with and that we're talking about and that do have a cost impact. And so I just wanted to flag that that's something that we are deeply concerned about in terms of the indoor air pollution.
Can I say this though? You can't tell us to stay inside and we're going to clean up your air inside, because you have a family in a tiny apartment that should be able to go out there and enjoy the outdoors and go for a walk and go for a run like our folks do by the coast or in the mountains. And so I think there's the immediate fine, stay inside right this second because it's really toxic out there. So let me help you clean up there inside. But it is troubling because staying, and we saw it in the pandemic, staying inside was driving us crazy when we had 4 or 5 kids trying to do their homework, being on Zoom, all parents were working in these tiny apartments. These communities at the end of the day are also lacking, we're really dense in housing and you have, I have one of the densest zip codes in the whole country here in Bell Gardens actually out there. And so staying inside feels a little suffocating, even if there's a little bit cleaner here. Wow, they give me.
I hear you because I have 2 kids and a husband, and we were in a 2-bedroom apartment. So that density, right? And so exactly that point of like staying inside, yeah, like when we were with the wildfires and the smoke outside, and then I think with the pandemic. So yes, I think that's something that I think we also have to grapple with, exactly as what you pointed out. So thank you for finding that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The whole issue around decarbonizing buildings has become a thing, and it's being incredibly well funded and well researched how much benefit we're going to get from building decarbonization, and let's just do it. Well, like, how are you going to do that in a way that's equitable? Oh, well, don't worry, we got you. We're going to do affordable housing first, right? Because that's equity. And I'm like, well, that's so fast. And we've been actually talking to folks who are living in ultra low income housing that's inhabitable. Never mind the gas stove, it's the mold, it's the infestations, it's leaky faucets, it's that there's still lead in homes, right? We think there isn't, right? And so when you go into a low income community and say we're going to, how you design the program is important. We can't keep designing programs for the top of the market and expect a different outcome. And so for us, yes, we're really worried about, we've worked on indoor air quality for years, right? How to do integrated pest management, how to, reduce asthma triggers in your home, how to get lead cleaned up out of your home, right? And so we would have liked a model like that, but it feels like this incredibly well-funded wave of a lot of good intention that isn't going to necessarily work out for our communities, right? And so we don't want to always be in a position to say no. We want to say yes to the things that we need. And so it's again about shifting resources to the environmental justice community and the justice community. So we work in community deeply with housing advocates, with anti-displacement and anti-gentrification advocates who are seeing the wave of green investment be green gentrification. And so they're like, Martha, stop those people. And I'm like, oh my God, but we have to be reasonable. But they're not thinking about gentrification and displacement. So you have to really put justice at the center. I talked to a group of green chemists and I asked them, where's the justice molecule? And I keep repeating that. Where is the justice that's at the core? Not an add-on, not once we complain, oh, we'll add this thing, a little patch, which doesn't essentially change the situation, right? And so, yes, we would love to have clean appliances, but we have to make sure that right now, given the pandemic, utility debt, water debt, back rent, that we're not adding pressures that will drive people out of their homes and not make them healthier. Or make them healthier for somebody else with a lot more money.
Well, thank you, Martha, for that last comment. There was a lot there and much appreciated. You've introduced a lot of additional sort of measures and issues. We don't have time to get into all of them, but it's really time for us to wrap up this roundtable, which I thought was terrific, frankly. I was very happy that Chanell, you found a way to bring in wildfires, which we'd overlooked, which obviously are a very, very serious problem for many reasons, including the health effects. Again, it's another way of showing the connections between climate policy and local air pollution policy, to the extent that climate change is worsening, is increasing the incidence and severity of wildfires. So I think there was a lot of agreement among you that we need more. We need to make sure that AB 617 gets fully implemented for the provisions it has. There also seems to be a lot of feeling that one needs to go beyond it. There's some feeling that some of the stuff on the books, I see some unease about cap and trade, for example, maybe wouldn't mind if that was very much reformed, to say the least. But I really appreciate your comments. I think it's enlightened all of us, those of us listening, I think really got a lot out of it. And I appreciate the efforts. I think really dealing with the very important issue of environmental justice requires getting the public involved and educating them. And I think you all are doing a lot. There are lives at stake here, and I applaud the fact that you're doing so much effectively to save lives. So the last thing I want to do is just make a self-interested comment, which is I hope that all three of you will stay in touch with us at Stanford, because many folks at Stanford are dealing with these issues. There's the Ethics in Society program here at Stanford that's very concerned. Believe it or not, there are a number of people in the economics department very much concerned with environmental justice. And the new School of Sustainability is obviously very concerned with the issue. So I think there can be big synergies here, and I hope we'll exploit them. So once again, thank you very much. And I also want to thank those at SIEPR, including Julia Huber and Adam Gorlick, who've done a lot to help bring this event and help it work. Until then, let's keep in touch, and thank you once again.
Thank you.